Thomas Dunckerley, not the most flattering picture. He wouldn't like it. Those in the audience who have an interest in the history of Freemasonry in Canada are no doubt thoroughly acquainted with the contributions made by the Grand Lodge of England, Scotland, and Ireland to the formation of a distinctly Canadian craft. What you may not be as familiar with, and what I want to highlight this afternoon, is the influence of Canada on the development of English Freemasonry. The threads connecting Canada and English Freemasonry are myriad and mostly left in an unanalyzed tangle. Today I will use as my example Thomas Dunckerley, whose newspaper obituaries in 1795 identify him as the Provincial Grand Master of England. Imprecise, but perhaps appropriate for a Mason with imperial aspirations. Who was Thomas Dunckerley, and what is this about an empire? When I had to sum up Dunckerley in a few words for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, I settled on identifying him as a naval officer, royal impostor, and Freemason. All true, but he would have been stung. In his day, Thomas Dunckerley was one of the best known and most influential Freemasons in England. He was also a tremendous innovator, both in terms of institutional organization and, intriguingly, the promotion of new or newly reinvented orders and degrees. Over the last quarter of the 18th century, Dunckerley was largely responsible for building up the provincial organization of the premier or modern Grand Lodge in southern England, serving as provincial Grand Master for 8 Masonic provinces by the 1790s, and establishing a model of local governance which has deeply influenced provincial Freemasonry in England to the present day. He focused on strengthening the Grand Lodge by instituting a much more formal and enforceable system of warranting, annual returns, and collection of fees for charity, and such Grand Lodge projects as Freemasons' Hall, which opened in London in 1775. As his obituaries suggest, Dunckerley was also a very active provincial Grand Master, assiduously visiting lodges in his provinces, cultivating their loyalty, and enforcing conformity. As for orders and degrees, we should recall that Dunckerley also took a leading part in the integration of the Royal Arch into the activities of the modern Grand Lodge. He was one of the companions at London's Turk's Head Tavern in 1766 who signed what they called the Charter of Compact of Grand Chapter, marking the beginning of modern's Grand Lodge association with the Royal Arch. Dunckerley went on to preside over the Royal Arch Masonry in 18 counties. Dunckerley enthusiastically promoted other degrees, commandeering and then commanding both the English Knights Templar and the recently formalized Royal Ark Mariners. He is the only English Freemason to obtain private warrants to hold sea lodges on shipboard, something I will talk about later in this lecture. Not content to restrict himself to the sea, Dunckerley presided over an occasional lodge associated with officers of the South Hampshire Militia in 1778. There is even evidence that he toyed with the idea of establishing an English adoptive right for women, floating a trial lodge in 1787 dedicated to Urania. Let me take a moment here and introduce you to what I call Dunkerland. I don't call it that in print. You're the only ones who are in on my little secret. But what you see here is a map of the traditional counties of England with a square and compass on every county that Dunckerley commanded, one way or another. I'm not sure how Durham snuck in there. He mostly restricts himself to the south. In some cases, he petitioned Grand Lodge to divide counties, making 2 provinces for him to preside over instead of just one, so that he split the Isle of Wight off from Hampshire, and he split Bristol off from the county. But Dunkerland gets bigger. Here is Dunkerland Part 2, on the high seas. And this is a map I know those of you who have been here for other lectures have seen, because I watched all of those, and I keep seeing this map. Surely we have another one of the empire, but but this seems to be a very good one. He thought about floating a lodge, no pun intended, for ladies. But he did other things. He was familiar with Morin's Rite of Perfection and Lambert de Linteau's Rite of 7 Degrees. Dunckerley had ample material for Masonic elaboration, and I think only death prevented him from creating a sort of English-Scottish Rite system. So it's entirely appropriate to speak of his Masonic empire in terms of rites, degrees, and jurisdictions. It's worth pointing out in the late 18th and early 19th century, there were many Masonic innovators. Dunckerley was by no means the only one. Some, like Cagliostro, with whom Dunckerley had dealings, and the unkind might suggest William Preston, manufactured degrees like the Egyptian Rite and the Herodom, with the intent of making a handsome living off the proceeds. Dunckerley was not one of those. He died poor. While he introduced many innovations, most were aimed at improving the administration of existing practice and bringing as many jurisdictions as he could under his own control for the good of the craft and the glorification of Grand Lodge, of course. In a terrestrial sense, Dunckerley made impressive claims. In January 1792, he wrote a letter to John Knight in Redruth, Cornwall. The letter deals mostly with relatively mundane business associated with the preparation for a Knights Templar conclave. But in it, Dunckerley refers to, quote, the Masonic knowledge which I have gleaned in Europe, America, and Africa for 40 years past. Africa. It's doubtful, though he did indeed take a tour of the northern Mediterranean, and we know he made a stop in Gibraltar, and you can see Africa from there on a clear day. So maybe. And when he mentions America, he means Canada. The contest for Canada involved him deeply. He was at Louisbourg, he was at Quebec, which became the mother of heroes for the mid-18th century, and Dunckerley borrowed a good deal of heroism from it as well. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, ending the 7 Years' War, hundreds of thousands of men were demobilized. Even though the United Kingdom kept a strong contingent of troops stationed in the American colonies and others settled in America, many more went home to the uncertainties of civilian life. Among them, Dunckerley, a master gunner and sometimes teacher of mathematics in the Royal Navy, had ample reason to be concerned. He was paid off in May 1763, having served most recently on HMS Prince, a second-rate ship of the line. This had been his most prestigious naval posting and was the culmination of a career that we can document at least as early as 1744. In the spring of 1763, Dunckerley was 42 years old, with a family to support and no real prospects. Dunckerley came from a modest but respectable background. One grandfather had been a physician, the other a yeoman of the guard. His father, Adam Dunckerley, who died in 1729, had been in royal service as a porter at Somerset House in London, which you see here. Adam's early death left his widow, Mary, and more importantly, son Thomas, to shift for themselves. Although Thomas never mentions it, he had 6 other brothers and sisters, and we're not sure how many of them survived. At least one granddaughter is named in his grandmother's will. But they're not convenient to his story, so we don't know anything much about them. Consequently, Thomas had no formal education, he had no inheritance, he even absconded from his apprenticeship, I just love this, to a barber and peruke maker before his time was up, which probably sometime in 1737. Dunckerley must have looked rather grimly towards the peace, which left him unemployed and not likely to find a job to his liking. Thomas was not, however, entirely without assets. He was, according to contemporary accounts, intelligent, articulate, he had an aristocratic bearing, When people were talking behind his back, they sometimes called him His Highness or His Majesty because he had such a royal bearing. He was ambitious. He wanted to be a gentleman. He came back from war convinced that he had to be a gentleman. He was prideful, he admits it. And he also concluded that only a significant rise in his social status would bring the financial stability that he needed to support his extended family. He also claimed to be 300 pounds in debt, which is why I have Fleet Prison here. It was a ruinous sum in the 18th century, when individuals could not declare bankruptcy unless they were in business. Faced with demanding creditors, ordinary people like Dunckerley were sent to debtor's prison until their debts were paid or settled, which was, of course, difficult to accomplish from prison. So if you can see the fellow up here leaning out of the prison to the wealthy passers-by is saying, "Pray remember ye poor debtors. Give me something so I can get back out." In the face of this disaster, Dunckerley escaped to sea, signing on as an able-bodied seaman for a brief tour of the Mediterranean aboard the Guadeloupe. While on the voyage, he devised an audacious plan. At some point, he realized that he bore a striking resemblance to members of the royal family. Through the quality of Dunckerley's surviving portraits makes it difficult for us to see now. There are enough contemporary reports that it seems quite likely to have been the case. But on a certain level, all old white men in powdered wigs look alike. So there you go. Using this as a starting point, Dunckerley crafted an explanation, composing and circulating a complicated and immensely engaging story, which he claimed was his late mother's deathbed confession of her seduction and adultery and his own illegitimacy. Some people are real bastards. He just claimed to be one. Every detail in this account, which in my book I call the accepted narrative, was false, down to the very date of his birth. But it was woven together so skillfully that many contemporaries and generations of Freemasons have accepted it at face value. The story was a sensation as it made the rounds of the 40-odd Freemasons and military men with whom Dunckerley pointedly shared it, hoping someone would bring it to the attention of George III. At its heart was the assertion that Thomas Dunckerley was not the son of Adam Dunckerley, porter at Somerset House. Rather, he was the son of the late king, George II. Conveniently, everyone in his story, which is very complicated and very wonderful, they were all dead too. When Dunckerley made up the story of his royal birth, he hoped it would lead to a lucrative government job, access to patronage, elevated social status. About that, he made no bones. As he wrote to George Viscount Townsend in 1766, quote, "I should be very happy if I could obtain any employment in any department that is adequate to my poor abilities and which would not depress me beneath the character of a gentleman," unquote. In that hope, he was very disappointed. After Dunckerley's retirement from the Royal Navy in 1763, he never again held a paid position of any sort. None. However, largely by relying on his grandmother's connections to the family of Sir Edward Walpole, looking very dashing here in the Order of the Bath, for whom she had worked as an infant nurse, Dunckerley was able to cobble together favors that allowed him to live, if not luxuriously, then at least with some comfort and dignity. Fortuitously for the craft, his lack of paid employment freed him to dedicate his time to the development of English Freemasonry, which he joined sometime around 1754. By the time Dunckerley disembarked into his civilian life in the 1760s, much of England had become an associational world. It was not a question of whether Dunckerley would join a society or two. Membership in something was almost a given for men of even modest means, but which ones he would fix on. In fact, he seems to have joined at least two other associations. the Sober Society of Portsmouth, sort of a Toastmasters of the 18th century, a group dedicated to self-improvement through public speaking. And are there Welsh speakers in the audience? No, good, I'll make this up. The Simrodorian, or something like that, a society of Welsh speakers based in London. You had to be able to get up and extemporaneously compose poetry in Welsh after drinking. But his heart was clearly in the lodge. Freemasonry's allure was many-faceted. It offered conviviality, entertainment, processions, fashionable patronage, employment, help to migrants. Freemasonry additionally boasted an unusually upwardly mobile membership and the most extensive network of associated lodges in the country, which provided a natural entree into advantageous social circles should a Mason move to a new town. The key to Dunckerley's enthusiasm may well have been the permanence and social status embodied in the Grand Lodge itself, with which he quickly became associated, that and the nifty titles. The Grand Lodge acted as a dominant central body, not entirely commanding, and yet coordinating the activities of affiliated lodges and provincial Grand Lodges throughout the kingdom and even the empire. It was able to marshal far more in the way of financial and social resources than other associations, and in particular, its ability to attract noble and royal patronage gave the Grand Lodge public visibility and importance. However, for the historian, the haphazard nature of 18th century record keeping is enormously frustrating. Tracing the Masonic career of any individual over the course of the 18th century is desperately difficult, even in the case of someone who promoted himself as enthusiastically as Dunckerley. Actually, Dunckerley is particularly problematic in that regard, because although he was a pioneer in insisting on proper warrants, payments, and annual returns of members, he consistently lied about his own past. We can attribute this tendency to three mutually reinforcing causes. The first is what I call Dunckerley's big lie. In my book, I don't call it a big lie, I call it the accepted narrative, because it's been believed so widely for so long, and because I want Freemasons to buy my book and not be offended. The one big lie necessitated all sorts of ancillary fibs, including playing with the calendar. The tendency of 19th century biographers to embellish his story adds another layer of chaos and confusion. The second cause he admitted is his admitted need to be important. He talks about this in his letters. And this led him to exaggerate military and Masonic service as well. Echoing the sense of self-importance which grew along with his Masonic influence, we find one of Dunckerley's allies referring to him in 1790 as a peer of the first rank of the kingdom, next to royalty itself. Finally, he seems to have been truly bad with numbers. This led to at least one official Masonic inquiry into his accounting. While he was exonerated of any willful wrongdoing, the bean counters in London wrung their hands. So, although it would be chronologically appropriate to begin a discussion of Dunckerley's involvement with Canada and the rest of the empire at the beginning of his Masonic career, we don't know for certain when that was. There is no independent verification of the year Dunckerley was initiated into Freemasonry. Few lodge minute books survive from that early on, and there was no requirement that was enforced for annual returns of members. For his part, Dunckerley gives contradictory evidence. All of the documents that contribute to the accepted narrative originate with Dunckerley himself. And while he undoubtedly told the truth nearly all the time, in his letters he says, "I have no vices," and he underlines it 3 times. He is intentionally unreliable when it comes to his personal history. Nonetheless, Dunckerley claimed to have been initiated by Portsmouth Lodge number 21, later known as the Lodge of Antiquity. And the date he provides most often is the 10th of January, 1754. He claims to have been exalted in the Royal Arch the same year. Let me introduce you to one of my favorite free online resources for doing Masonic studies. This is a screen grab of Lane's Masonic records, which is available thanks to, amongst other entities, the Library and Museum of Freemasonry at the United Grand Lodge of England. Lane's Masonic records started out in the 19th century. John Lane was an accountant who was driven mad by the conflicting numbers and dates of English lodges, and he began a massive index, which has been put online and brought up to date by the staff at the Library and Museum of Freemasonry. And it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. If you want to talk to me about that later, I'll be happy to help you. But what this shows us is Portsmouth and some of the lodges that he was Plymouth. And this shows us some of the lodges that he was affiliated with while he was still a very young man in Masonry. So he says that he was initiated in 1754 in January, and predictably that's a problem. The January date was when he was still at sea aboard HMS Tiger until the end of March. And then later in 1793, just to give you an idea of how complicated this gets, he suggests that he was passed to the second degree in 1747. Okay. Nonetheless, sometime in 1754 is generally agreed upon by Masonic authorities, and there's sufficient documentation to place Dunckerley in and out of Portsmouth during that year. And so it's just going to have to do for now. Whatever the ambiguity surrounding the date of Dunckerley's entry into Freemasonry, he took to it with alacrity. While still attached to HMS Vanguard between 1755 and 61, Dunckerley joined two lodges in and around Plymouth. That's Plymouth, in Devon. Number 67, meeting at the Mason's Arms Tavern in Plymouth Dock, and number 134, meeting at the Pope's Head Tavern in Plymouth. Though both of these lodges were affiliated with the Modern's Grand Lodge, there were other options for local Masons. A quick survey of lodges meeting in and around Plymouth at that time shows considerable diversity. John Lane's records reveal two lodges attached to military regiments, and another lodge which met briefly at the Mason's Arms Tavern in 1763. These were all warranted by the Ancients Grand Lodge, about which more in just a minute. Then there were a number of other Moderns lodges, including 135, meeting at the Mitre Tavern, number 232, meeting at the White Hart Tavern in Old Town Plymouth, the Lodge of Sincerity, I love these names, the Lodge of Sincerity, number 454, meeting at the Three Crowns, Lodge of Friendship, number 416, meeting at the Bunch of Grapes, the Lodge of Contentment, number 269, which met briefly at the significantly named General Wolfe in Plymouth Dock, and finally the Lodge of Concord, number 463, meeting at the Old King's Arms in Plymouth Dock. Another Plymouth lodge, with which Dunckerley may have had some connection, demonstrates the mutability of Masonic allegiances. In 1759, Lodge number 237 obtained a warrant. Tradition has Dunckerley assisting in the organization of the lodge, but his influence did not prevent subsequent desertion to the ancients. Lodge member R.M. Gannon lamented in a 1772 letter to Grand Secretary James Hazeltine that half of the members of 237, then known as the Marine Lodge, had applied for an ancient's warrant, effectively, if you'll pardon the pun, jumping ship. You're supposed to laugh. Okay, thank you. Every other Navy town in England could tell similar stories. 18th century Britain was an imperial country, and frequently a country at war. These factors combined to make the Royal Navy both very large and very active. Because Plymouth was an important naval base, it had a significant transient and cosmopolitan population of men who brought with them a variety of Masonic experiences and affiliations. Not only those that I just mentioned, but there were also Masons familiar with the workings of Irish, Scots, French, and more exotically, even Swedish and German lodges. Masonic historians have argued that Plymouth, like its companion Portsmouth, served as a fertile petri dish of Masonic traditions and rituals, which surely had a profound impact on provincial Freemasons, especially Dunckerley. Perhaps the most potent influence was the newly established rival Grand Lodge, whose members called themselves Ancients. One of the explanations put forward by the Ancients Grand Lodge at their founding in 1751 was that the premier, the first, or the Moderns Grand Lodge, had grown, but in growing had lost sight of its rich cultural and spiritual heritage, and that as a result, its workings or lectures and rituals were streamlined, dry, and devoid of meaning. Thus, in a real sense, the assertion was that Freemasons made or initiated into modern lodges were only shadow Masons, deprived of the full knowledge of the secrets of Freemasonry. Lawrence Dermott, for whom no image survives, even though he was a printer and engraver, was the Irish-born Grand Secretary and chief ideologue of the Ancients. And he argued that modern Masons were themselves unorthodox, irregular, and that their falling away from true Masonry was the fault of the founders of the Moderns Grand Lodge in 1717, who abandoned ancient Masonry for inferior modern innovations. The Ancients were doing nothing less than restoring true ancient Freemasonry. So the older Grand Lodge is modern, and the newer Grand Lodge is ancient. Keep that straight. The moderns had an answer for that sort of impudence, and as it turned out, their answer was Thomas Dunckerley. Dermott's were fighting words, but many Masonic historians have argued that Dunckerley was sympathetic to Dermott's charges. Some, notably 19th century Masonic mythologist George Oliver, don't believe anything he writes, by the way. He was writing in the middle of the 19th century. It's gorgeous stuff. Writes beautifully, it's persuasive, it's all made up. He credited Dunckerley with devising more or less on the spot a comprehensive strategy for reinvigorating the Moderns Grand Lodge. Dunckerley's plan, it's argued, involved the systematic revision of existing degrees and the introduction of new ones, frequently using rituals and traditions that Dunckerley had noted down on surreptitious visits to ancient lodges. Yeah. There was even talk of a spurious set of Dunckerley lectures that were alleged to have been temporarily adopted by the Grand Lodge for universal use. There is no evidence for any of this, and if Dunckerley was influenced by ancient traditions, it's a challenge to see it in his few surviving Masonic writings. In the autumn of 1757, Dunckerley offered for sale a pamphlet containing 2 Masonic charges. The better known of the 2 is titled The Light and Truth of Masonry Explained, being the substance of a charge delivered at Plymouth in April 1757. The Light and Truth is frequently cited as proof of Dunckerley's native genius for what he called the 5th science. I don't need to tell you, probably. The Masonic 5th science is geometry, as commemorated in the floating G frequently found in the decoration of lodge rooms or in Masonic images. Later, most Freemasons would equate immutable principles with God, not geometry. But Dunckerley understood the G and the 5th science to go together. The progression, is a logical one. And happily, a switch in meaning, a switch in identification didn't require redecoration. Dunckerley understood geometry not as a species of mathematics, but as the fixed principles and moral laws that Freemasons are supposed to follow. And those immutables are the subject of his lecture. Unfortunately, given its lofty aims, there's nothing about Dunckerley's talk that elicits particular admiration. In many ways, it's a very typical lodge talk, a motivational talk that men give in men's clubs the world over. Aim high. Be true to yourself. Get a hold of your passions. It's an entirely creditable little talk, especially given that Dunckerley had no education to fall back on. Dunckerley's oration was probably pitched perfectly to his audience of mid-level military men and members of the middling classes who aspired to politeness and believed in personal responsibility. Dunckerley, who sneaks up on the ancients a few pages into the talk, uses as his tool no less a personage than St. John the Evangelist. He uses St. John to explain to the ancients just how misguided they are in becoming schismatics. He says, "These are the persons of whom St. John says, they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. But they went out, that they might be made manifest that they were not of us. And thus it is that those who depart from the light bring an evil report to the craft." It's difficult to reconcile this pointed rejection with Dunckerley then going about inconspicuously infiltrating ancients' lodges. But we've already noted that he's willing to do extraordinary things in pursuit of his goals. So who's to say? The fact remains that as time went on, Dunckerley developed an intense personal rivalry with Lawrence Dermot, which both men touched on in their correspondence, but which manifested itself most profoundly in Dunckerley's determined efforts to win over the Royal Arch for the Modern's Grand Lodge. Competition between the rival English Grand Lodges and the personal enmity between Dunckerley and Dermot formed the intriguing backdrop for Dunckerley's involvement with the development of Freemasonry in Canada. You wondered when I'd get to Canada. Here I am. Despite his best efforts to stay in port, for though a Navy man, he devoted considerable effort to not actually being at sea. He didn't like it. He kept switching from ships that were going out to ships that were in ordinary being refitted. He tried to stay in port all that he could. All that he could. And I speculate in the book, why did he do that? Was he a family man? No, because once he's actually out of the Navy, he never stays home. He's always out in his provinces. He's always out with the lodges. So I think the thing is that he doesn't like being on the water. Yeah. Maybe he got seasick. Lord Nelson got seasick, so who knows? 1757 found Dunckerley still in the Royal Navy, and the 7 Years' War was far from over. And he was assigned to a ship that looked a lot like this one. This is HMS Buckingham, which is of the same size and design as the Vanguard, which was Dunckerley's ship when he went to Canada. That September, he shipped out aboard the Vanguard, headed for North America. Dunckerley's enthusiasm for Freemasonry was unabated, and as we've seen, he seems to have done some of his most creative thinking while at sea. So in January 1760, when the Vanguard briefly returned to England, Dunckerley did something astonishing. He went to the Grand Lodge in London and obtained an entirely novel warrant, a personal one, which permitted him to constitute lodges on ships at sea, in this case particularly the Vanguard. This was the first warrant explicitly intended to establish a lodge active on a ship while it was at sea, rather than one constitutive of naval brethren while they were in port. By the end of his Navy days, Dunckerley had convened lodges on 3 ships in the Royal Navy, the Vanguard, the Prince, and the Guadeloupe, using 2 separate warrants. We know very little about these sea lodges, and it's very likely that aside from their floating venues, there was nothing particularly remarkable about them. Like most lodges of the time, and especially regimental lodges, which is what we should really be comparing them to, their very transience meant that the survival of records was really very unlikely. Even the practical existence of the lodge supposed to have been held on the Guadeloupe is questionable, since Dunckerley was on board for such a short time, the end of January through mid-April of 1765. What's most fascinating about these lodges is what the notion of obtaining warrants for them suggests about Dunckerley. Aside from his obvious enthusiasm for Freemasonry, the Sea Lodges are a demonstration of Dunckerley's inventiveness. If Dermot's ancients had a corner on the market for regimental lodges, which they did, Dunckerley was determined to take the high seas for the moderns. Since the warrants Dunckerley used were personal licenses made out in his name, the lodges only lasted as long as he remained with a particular ship. Disappointingly, the notion of sea lodges never seems to have found a wider audience, but this was far from the last of his Masonic innovations. When the Vanguard sailed in 1757, it was headed to Canada to fight the French. This latest round of hostilities between British forces in the American colonies and French troops in New France began in 1753 with skirmishes over possession of the Ohio Valley. As the conflict escalated, it became part of the global phenomenon now known as the 7 Years' War. British victories at the key French fortress Louisbourg in July 1758 opened up the St. Lawrence and was followed by the British siege and seizure of Quebec in September 1759. As the gunner for a sizable British ship, Dunckerley played an important role in the battle at Quebec, but would not have been a participant in the battlefield itself, which one of his enthusiastic 19th century biographers suggested. Nor did gunners actually man the cannon, as has been suggested by other eulogists. According to the Sea Gunner's Vade Mecum, which is a wonderful, wonderful little book from 1812, I quote, "The duty of a gunner in the Royal Navy is to take charge of the artillery and ammunition on board, to examine and observe that the former are always kept in order and fitted with tackles and other furniture, and to teach the sailors to exercise the cannon." And here is the front page from the Sea Gunner's Vade Mecum. Vade Mecum Handbook. That rules out, unfortunately, the sort of personal heroics and marksmanship Dunckerley's admirers have ascribed to him. He is certainly not responsible for the demolition of what John Hamilton Graham termed the prioral house of the Knights Hospitallers of Malta. He did not shoot at it. However, he does seem to have done something rather remarkable of a Masonic nature at Quebec. By the second half of the 18th century, regimental lodges were an increasingly common feature of British military life. At the Siege of Louisbourg in 1758, 9 of the 14 British infantry battalions were known to have contained regimental lodges. A handful held warrants from the Moderns Grand Lodge. However, many other warrants were issued by the Grand Lodge of Scotland, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, or indirectly through various provincial Grand Lodges in the American colonies, especially that of New England, headquartered in Boston. Then there were Dunckerley's arch rivals, the Ancients. After 1751, the Ancient Grand Lodge made steady incursions into the regimental market. The speculation has long been that this was due to the Ancients' willingness to recognize and work the Royal Arch degree, but it seems clear that there were other intrinsic differences between the Ancients and the Moderns, including class distinctions, the beginnings of national identities, and of course, politics. For example, long before the end of the War for American Independence in 1783, there were almost no American lodges that still owed obedience to the Moderns Grand Lodge, which was strongly identified with British officers and the government they represented. Most American lodges had made the switch to the Ancients, and during the early years of the Republic, quickly established independent state Grand Lodges. Thus, ignoring for now the existence of Francophone Freemasons resident in both Montreal and Quebec, as described by Jacques Rouland, Freemasons attached to British forces that gathered in Quebec in the winter of 1759 belonged to 8 or 9 regimental lodges, holding warrants from several different Grand Lodges. Robertson lists 7, 5 held Irish warrants. 1 was warranted by the ancients, another by the moderns in New England. And R.F. Gould suggests there was a far greater number and acknowledges that many of them were working without warrants or had lost their warrants. And so they don't appear in the usual sources. This is the group whose representatives chose a provincial Grand Master, Lieutenant John Price Gwynedd, from an Irish lodge, and 6 months later his successor, Simon Fraser, one of 7 Simon Frasers in the 78th Regiment. Tradition, that popular but unreliable source, has it that Thomas Dunckerley was in town for Fraser's investiture on the 24th of June, 1760. Possessed of a personal warrant of authority from the Moderns Grand Lodge, a sort of roving provincial Grand Mastership, Dunckerley duly installed Fraser with the blessings of the Modern Grand Lodge. There are 2 noteworthy aspects to this event, which sounds remarkably like one of the stories Thomas Dunckerley made up for consumption back home. First, there is no record in the minutes of the United Grand Lodge of England of Dunckerley's alleged roving commission. Dunckerley does not even seem to have ever mentioned this first commission in later boasting of his Masonic achievements. Again, gaps in the evidence are maddening. In 1891, Henry Sadler reproduced a portion of a 1769 letter from John Gawler, a veteran of Quebec who retired to London in 1767 and acted as an unofficial liaison between Freemasons in Canada and the Moderns Grand Lodge. In it, Gawler describes events that had taken place a decade before involving Dunckerley and his Masonic activities in Quebec. Sadler does not indicate where the letter was or who had brought it to his attention, merely that it did not exist at the Grand Lodge in London. In the excerpts, the author explains that in June 1760, Dunckerley presided over the installation of Colonel Sir Simon Fraser of the 78th Regiment of Foot as Provincial Grand Master of Canada, after his selection by the assembled regimental Freemasons in Quebec. The quote Sadler includes reads, "Brother Dunckerley, of His Majesty's ship the Vanguard, who was possessed with a power from the Grand of England to inspect into the state of the craft wheresoever he might go, honored them with his approbation of their conduct and installed Brother Fraser in his high office." With only a fragmentary letter to go on, Dunckerley's role as an official representative of the Moderns Grand Lodge seems unlikely until we consider the contents of James Thompson's letterbox. I don't have a picture of his letterbox, but here's his house. As many of you probably know, Thompson was a Mason from Scotland who volunteered for Fraser's Highlanders and after the war settled in Quebec and built this fine house. For many years, he served there as Grand Secretary for the Provincial Grand Lodge and was an active member of St. Andrew's Lodge No. 2 Provincial in Quebec. A lovely biographical sketch of Thompson can be found in Milbourne's article on Freemasonry at the Siege of Quebec. Fortunately, Thompson was a pack rat, especially when it came to Masonic correspondence. And his letterbox contains 128 pages of script, and it's preserved at the Library of the Grand Lodge of Quebec. It contains documents about the very early days of Freemasonry in Quebec, including the original of Gawler's reminiscence and Thompson's own notes about the installation, which was indeed conducted by Dunckerley. So there we go. Evidence that Dunckerley does not provide, but someone else does. Thompson's letter book includes a draft to the Moderns Grand Master in which he acknowledges Dunckerley's influence. The letter details the difficulty of the lodges in Quebec that the lodges in Quebec faced in trying to maintain regular communication with London, and especially their frustration and not being allowed to routinely select their own provincial Grand Master. So, perhaps Dunckerley did have a writ from the Grand Lodge, or maybe he bluffed it. Calculating correctly that seizing Canada for the Moderns would win him credibility back home and was worth the risk. Either way, Dunckerley saw an opportunity to wrest Quebec, at least, from the ancients, and he took it. This brings us to the second intriguing aspect of this event. The competition and even enmity, it's not too strong a word, between the ancient and the modern Grand Lodges and their factotums, Dunckerley and Dermot, were very real in London. But across the ocean, in Quebec, being a brother Freemason was more important than to which Grand Lodge one owed obedience. Thompson records an event which could not have happened in the British Isles proper, a brotherly cooperation and mutual recognition between Masons belonging not only to rival Grand Lodges, but those of other nations. This was a pivotal event in the course of Dunckerley's career, and I argue for the future of English Freemasonry as well. Before Quebec, Dunckerley was an enthusiastic but not terribly important Freemason. After Quebec, he was a force of nature. He talked big, but he demonstrated that he could be counted on to deliver on his claims. Quebec gave Dunckerley the confidence and credibility that underpinned his entire subsequent Masonic career. The modern Grand Lodge accepted the gift of Canada, even though they held it only briefly from a numerical point of view, as the ancients were already on the ascendant in the province and elsewhere. As evidence of both the moderns' claim to Canada and the imperial aspirations of the modern's Grand Lodge, a phenomena studied at length by one of your previous lecturers, Jessica Harlan-Jacobs, Fraser's name appears on the list of provincial Grand Masters in John Entick's 1767 edition of Anderson's Book of Constitutions. The other provinces named give us an idea of the Grand Lodge imperial strategy at this time, with Fraser appearing alongside other gentlemen appointed to similar offices in Bengal, Lower Saxony, New Jersey, all of the Russias, the Cape Coast in Africa, Savoy, Andalusia, Jamaica, Antigua, Louisbourg, Italy, and my favorite, the Circle of Franconia. Finally, we need to note that roving commissions at the level of provincial Grand Master of the sort Dunckerley claimed to have had were not unheard of. Beginning in the 1720s, the first provincial Grand Masters in India had what was actually a roving commission. They had no staff, no permanent base. They were mostly with the military or the East India Company, so were likely to be out of India a good deal of the time. Closer to Dunckerley's own time, Grand Master Earl Ferrars granted a roving commission in 1762 to John Blewett, commander of the Admiral Watson, an Indiaman for East India. He was to inspect and do Masonic business where no other provincial is to be found. Unlike Dunckerley, all of these commissions, all of these appointments are in the minutes of the modern Grand Lodge. Perhaps Dunckerley is the exception that proves the rule with regard to roving commissions. Quebec provided Dunckerley with that prized 18th century characteristic known as bottom, foundation, support, credibility, gravitas. And though he did not return, neither did he forget Canada. He retained a lively interest in the empire, British and Masonic, especially when he had the opportunity to best Lawrence Dermot out of a lodge warrant. The rivalry is demonstrated, if you will forgive me, in ample form by a letter Dunckerley wrote to Grand Secretary William White in 1785 about lodges in Newfoundland. "You may remember," he says, "I jockeyed Dermot out of Newfoundland by obtaining a warrant for a lodge at Placentia. It has produced another petition for a lodge, Harbor Grace, on the island. I received it this morning under the cover of a letter from my very worthy deputy, Dr. Campbell of Poole. I beg you will get it executed in the same neat manner as that for Gloucester, as soon as possible, and send it by the Poole coach to Alex Campbell, Esquire, at that place, as the ship that is to convey it is sailing under orders." Lawrence Dermot died in 1791, and his great adversary, Thomas Dunckerley, followed in 1795. Dying in Portsmouth, Dunckerley was too far away to be buried at the Templar Church in London, as he had requested. With their passing, the Masonic landscape shifted perceptibly as new agents in both Grand Lodges looked to the future and, following the lead of those regimental Masons in Quebec, gathered to create the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813. And with a picture of the library in the United Grand Lodge, I thank you very much for your attention.